The Persian Empire was one of the most powerful civilizations the ancient world had ever seen. From the deserts of Mesopotamia to the mountains of Anatolia, it ruled over millions of people. But with power came fear. And when someone broke the laws of the empire, or worse, insulted the king, they weren't just punished, they were broken. Their deaths were turned into warnings that others would never forget. These punishments weren't simple executions. They were drawn out, humiliating, and designed to disgust even those who only watched. To live under the Persians was to know that pain could be turned into a spectacle, and that your body might become part of a public show of terror. Scaphism, the most horrifying death. There was one punishment so vile that even the Greeks, who wrote down the story, struggled to describe it. It was called Scaphism, and it has gone down in history as one of the most disgusting ways a human being could die. The condemned man was stripped naked and forced into two hollowed-out logs or boats, his head, hands, and feet sticking out. Then, the Persians fed him milk and honey until his stomach could hold no more. Soon he would vomit and soil himself, but they didn't stop. They rubbed honey all over his exposed skin and left him out in the sun. Insects swarmed. Flies, wasps, and beetles crawled into every opening of his body. His skin became a feast. His own waste attracted more and more bugs. Day after day, he would remain alive, slowly rotting, eaten from the inside and outside at the same time. The story tells us that it could take over a week before the victim finally died. His body bloated, unrecognizable, consumed by insects. It was not only a death, it was a living hell, carefully crafted to disgust and terrify anyone who heard of it. Skin as a warning. The Persians believed that the body itself could be turned into a message. When a corrupt judge named Scaphism was caught taking bribes, King Cambyses decided to give him a punishment that no one in the empire could forget. Scaphism was executed, and then his skin was flayed from his body. The strips of skin were used to cover the judge's chair, his very seat of power. His son was then forced to sit on that chair when he replaced his father as judge. Every time he touched the seat, he knew he sat on the remains of his own father. It was more than cruelty. It was theater. The Persians wanted their officials to remember that corruption could stain their very skin, and that the throne of justice itself was covered with flesh. Impalement. Impalement was used across the ancient world, but the Persians practiced it with a terrifying consistency. Victims were lifted and forced down onto sharp stakes that pierced their bodies. Some were impaled to the stomach, others through the chest, and some were even forced onto stakes that entered from below and emerged through the shoulder or mouth. The stakes were planted along roads or outside city gates, where everyone could see them. The message was clear. This is what happens when you betray the empire. Greek historians claim that one Persian ruler, Darius I, ordered 3,000 men impaled at once after a rebellion. Whether the number is exact or not, the sheer scale of the punishment shows how impalement was not just about killing. It was about filling the landscape with human bodies, each one nailed to wood, each one rotting in the sun as a reminder to the living. The Tower of Heads, public display, was a key part of Persian punishment. After battles, Persian kings sometimes ordered that the heads of the defeated be cut off and stacked into great towers. These towers stood outside cities as silent walls of skulls, showing travelers and enemies alike what happened when you defied the empire. Imagine walking toward a Persian stronghold and seeing hundreds, even thousands, of skulls piled together, the smell of rot still clinging to the bones. It was not just death, it was humiliation stretched out for the world to see. Buried alive. Some victims were punished by being buried alive, especially those who committed crimes against the gods. The Persians practiced a form of this called interment, where criminals, sometimes women accused of sacrilege, were lowered into underground chambers with little food or water, left to die slowly in the earth. The silence of this punishment made it different from others. There was no spectacle of blood or public screams. Instead, the condemned disappeared beneath the ground, their deaths hidden, but their fate whispered about among the living. It was said that this punishment was used against people who broke sacred taboos. For them, the earth itself became the prison and the grave, the whip of death. The Persians also used beatings and whippings not as discipline, but as executions. Victims were tied to posts or laid flat on the ground, and whips tipped with metal or bone tore into their skin. The goal was not a quick death. It was exhaustion, bleeding, and collapse over time. The sound of lashes echoing in a Persian courtyard, the smell of blood rising in the air, the cries of pain. It was theater of cruelty. And when the victim finally died, their body remained as proof of how long human beings could be made to suffer before the end. Scene 8. Punishment by thirst. Water was life in Persia. To die of thirst was to experience one of the most agonizing ends imaginable. Prisoners were sometimes chained in the desert, left without shade, their mouths drying, their lips cracking under the blazing sun. Some accounts tell of men who were tied up in salt deserts, where the ground itself reflected the heat back at them, making the air burn like fire. No knife touched them. No executioner swung a blade. But the cruelty lay in the waiting, in the slow destruction of the body as it begged for water that never came. Tongues torn out. The Persians knew the power of words. A lie, a rumor, or an insult to the king could spread like fire. And so, when they caught men guilty of treasonous speech, they sometimes silenced them in the most brutal way possible. The punishment was simple but horrifying. The tongue was cut out. It left the victim alive but broken, unable to speak again. The silence that followed was its own kind of execution. Imagine standing before a crowd, your mouth forced open, iron tools reaching in, tear away the very thing that gave you a voice. It wasn't just mutilation, it was humiliation for the rest of their lives. The victims were living warnings. Everyone who saw them was reminded that in Persia, even words could cost you your tongue. Castration as control. In a world where manhood meant power, the Persians used castration as one of their most degrading punishments. Some criminals, rebels, or even slaves were condemned to lose their ability to reproduce. Castration turned men into symbols of weakness, stripping them of pride and condemning them to lives of ridicule. The Persians also used eunuchs in their court, sometimes chosen, sometimes forced. But for those who received it as punishment, it was a living shame. It wasn't just about removing strength. It was about removing identity, leaving men alive but marked forever as less than whole. The eyes of betrayal. Betrayal to the Persian throne was not forgiven easily. Some men were not killed at all. Instead, they were blinded, their eyes gouged out, leaving them alive in darkness. This was a punishment worse than death for many. Living blind in the ancient world meant dependence, weakness, and constant danger. But the Persians sometimes allowed such men to live, not out of mercy, but because their blindness was more useful as a reminder than their death would ever be. A blinded nobleman walking through a marketplace, guided by a child, became an image that stuck in the minds of all who saw him. It said more than any execution. Betrayal left you crippled, stripped of vision, stripped of dignity. Crucifixion. Though the practice is often tied to Rome, crucifixion was also used by the Persians. Victims were nailed or tied to wooden beams, left hanging under the sun. It was a slow, public death. The body struggled against itself, every breath a battle. Muscles cramped, blood dried on open wounds, and hours stretched into days. Sometimes, the condemned begged for death that would not come quickly. The Persians used crucifixion for rebels, traitors, and even captured enemies. It wasn't just execution, it was display. A crucified body at the city gate was a warning stronger than any written law. Death by ashes. There are stories of a Persian punishment where criminals were suffocated in ashes. A chamber would be filled with fine ash, and the condemned was forced inside. Guards stirred the ash with whips until victims choked, the fine dust filling their mouths, throats, and lungs. The death was slow and panicked. Every gasp drew in more suffocating dust. The body fought until it collapsed, buried alive in something as light as powder. This was not just cruelty. It was creativity. Death by something soft, transformed into a tool of horror, burden of the rocks. Some criminals were crushed under the weight of stones. The Persians would place the condemned on the ground and slowly pile heavy rocks onto their chest. At first, the body strained, ribs cracking under the pressure. Breathing became impossible. Death came not in a single moment, but in the slow realization that each breath was smaller than the last, each sound of bones snapping closer to the end. The executioners did not rush. They placed the stones carefully, watching the victim struggle, dragging out the death for as long as possible. Why disgust was the goal. The Persians were not unique in using cruelty. Many ancient empires did. But what made their punishment stand out was how they mixed death with disgust. They wanted people to feel sick at the sight of them. They wanted officials to sit on flayed skin, crowds to hear the buzzing of insects around Scaphism victims, rebels to look at towers of heads as they approached the city. Punishment was not only about control, it was about fear that lived in the stomach as much as the mind. To live under the Persians was to know that the body itself could become a tool of politics, a message carved into flesh, blood, and bone. Their empire may be remembered for its greatness, but behind its power lay a system of punishment so vile, so shocking, that even centuries later we call it what was disgusting.